Welcome to OU Informed, a podcast where Open University academics illuminate the issues and topics of our times. In this episode, we explore the dietary and ethical case for veganism. 2018 saw an explosion of interest in veganism and plant-based diets. Celebrity ambassadors and well-being gurus fell over themselves to extol the virtues of living ethically, with high street brands, restaurants and supermarkets all diversifying their product ranges to satisfy rising demand. An interesting recent development was a report in August by the Intergovernmental Panel on climate change, suggesting a reduction in meat consumption and reforms to farming were both crucial steps in tackling the negative human impacts on the environment. Dr. Matthew Cole is a lecturer in sociology at the Open University. His research focuses on how we learn to conceptually separate other animals into categories such as friends or food, and how these categories then serve the interests of industries which profit from animal exploitation. From these concerns, Matthew also researches the role of veganism as an alternative to animal exploitation. Despite a recent explosion of interest in veganism, there still seems to be a reticence around vegans and how veganism differs from the cultural norm, particularly in the media.
So why is it that it seems to be perceived as strange by society at large? So vegans can be portrayed as overly sentimental sometimes. So as a way of undermining veganism by kind of portraying non-veganism as more realistic, and by realistic what's meant is nature is violent and red in tooth and claw, and vegans are just too soppy to really get to grips with that. So vegans are overly sentimental, which is not true. In my experience as a vegan, most vegans are very well acquainted with the violence of the animal exploiting industries. They tend to know a lot more about it than non-vegans, because part of a vegan transition is often sort of confronting undercover slaughterhouse footage, say, or undercover footage of farming practices and that kind of thing, and becoming, very upset, outraged, motivated, even more passionate, even more committed to your choice. But there's all kinds of other negative stereotypes too about vegans. Sometimes we're characterised as being hostile, extremists. We can be characterised as just straight out ludicrous. The very idea of veganism gets portrayed as ridiculous, or it gets portrayed as impossible, too difficult, hard work, self-denying, pleasureless, all these sorts of things. So all these stereotypes are circulating in the culture. So it's kind of interesting to be able to bring those to light as a sociologist through the practice of sociological research. So in popular culture at the moment, it's very much focused on diet, plant-based diets, but that's only one component, albeit a very significant component, because that's a lot of how we exploit other animals. But vegans, also oppose animal testing, use of animals in entertainment, for sport, for anything really that's interfering with what those animals want to do. So the fundamental, I suppose, the bottom line of veganism for me is opposing exploitation in all its forms of other animals, imposing human will on them. They're not ours. They are their own. Just as we think about other humans, we hopefully always think it's a bad idea to exploit other human beings. And when we find out that this has been going on, we kind of react with outrage or horror or sympathy for the people who have been exploited and so forth. So from a vegan perspective, it's fundamentally the same process.
Many of us have been guilty at some stage of projecting human characteristics onto animals, whether that's through social media or how we interact with our pets. But at the same time, we're happy to eat and exploit animals. How and why is that moral inconsistency happening?
Well, I co-wrote a whole book about that phenomenon, which is called Our Children and Other Animals. So it's particularly looking at the socialisation process, how we bring up children to believe these contradictory things. But on the one hand, children are taught to sort of feel affection and care for certain types of animals and to kind of ignore other types completely. And you see this weird sort of juxtaposition is crystallised in the phenomenon of the happy meal, the fast food happy meal. So often these are promoted through tie-ins with animated films for children, which often feature non-human animal characters. So in the happy meal, you'll get dead animals in a burger or a nugget form or whatever, and you'll get a toy animal, like a plastic or a plush toy of, Simba, the Lion King, or Babe the pig, or whoever it might be. So children's empathy is kind of focused on these representations of animals and diverted from the real animals who were killed to produce the food in the box. So that got me and my colleague Kate Stewart, another sociologist, that got us thinking about that whole process in general terms, and we started researching it as widely as we could. So looking at the films themselves, looking at children's toys and games, clothing, which often has animal characters on the clothing, which is heavily gendered. The types of animals that boys are dressed in are different to the ones girls are dressed in. Magazines aimed at children, social media games, like anything we could think of. And we were finding the same thing over and over again, this very predictable pattern of making children focus on these cute, anthropomorphized representations of animals and not the actual animals who could really benefit from their care and affection, the ones who are actually suffering in all the ways that humans exploit other animals.
Are there any tenets of veganism that are consistent with existing mainstream belief systems or cultural values?
Yeah, there certainly is. I mean, this is the really weird thing about the juxtaposition that we've already spoken about a bit, about children being sort of given these contradictory messages, because the positive version, i.e. to feel empathy, compassion, care, love, affection, whatever, towards some kinds of animals, that is a very positive value. So as a vegan, all you're really doing is broadening that out, or stopping doing the diverting away from the ones who need care and affection and actually paying attention to them. So, and that's why I think a lot of vegans do go through this process of almost making yourself more aware of what is done to other animals that's harmful, painful, exploitative, abusive, violent, whatever. Because you think, no, they actually need our help, and therefore we need to understand what's happening to them. We need to bolster our empathy to make us more empathetic. So that value is already there in the mainstream culture. You know, people, everybody pretty much, I think, likes to think that we're compassionate people, that we're caring people, that we're not callous, we're not thoughtless. We don't condone violence without purpose. So veganism is about saying, yeah, okay, well, go vegan then, you know? That's the logical extension of embodying that value of being a compassionate human.
Is a barrier to veganism perhaps this sort of moral relativism we sometimes experience in modern society, where veganism emphasises a strong ethical code, particularly around compassion? Have we become almost too utilitarian and morally flexible to accommodate this way of thinking?
Yeah, quite possibly. I think one of the perhaps troubling aspects of the current explosion of veganism in the culture is the extent to which it might be being commodified or packaged as a lifestyle kind of accessory. And I think that's risky because that could slide into kind of faddism, which has been one of the stereotypes laid at veganism's door in the past already anyway, and it might become self-perpetuating. So that's something that concerns a lot of us, I think, in the vegan movement, because going back to something you were saying earlier about earlier belief systems, capitalism is the belief system that dominates our lives now, and that's the belief system that gives us a utilitarian attitude towards other animals, i.e. as exploitable resources, as resources from which profit can be extracted, fundamentally. So it's human interests have been constructed around this idea of instrumentalising, to use a bit of jargon, a bit of sociological jargon, instrumentalising other animals, and to deny their subjectivity, deny their agency, deny the fact that they're unique beings with their own interests, with a desire to continue living. Fundamentally, they're not suicidal, although they're often presented that way on butcher shops and so on.
Why isn't that attitude a mainstream attitude?
Well, I think going back to capitalism again, I think that's a big part of it. There's a lot of tradition involved here in terms of, for instance, diet. What people eat is very much influenced by cultural traditions, but the extent of consumption of other animals has massively exploded, in the last 100, 150 years, since capitalism really got involved with animal exploitation and the intensification of it. That means you can churn out more and more animal products, and therefore you need to create a market for them. You need to stimulate more animal product consumption, and that is what's happened, through advertising, through the intervention of the state support for increasing animal consumption. That's got a long history as well. So the more that process happens, the more money there is to be made out of exploiting animals, the more there is a cultural interest in stopping people thinking about that. So you see, at the same time, this increase in representations of animals, which are distracting, especially aimed at children, but not only aimed at children. So, if you look at the animated films, and there are loads of them every year, and they're very, very popular. Yes, they're aimed at children, but they're aimed at children being taken to the cinema by their parents, usually. And there are messages there for parents as well. There's a reassurance that, yes, it's okay to give your children these kind of messages and then go to a fast food restaurant afterwards and give them some meat.
Is there such a disconnect between animals being reared and slaughtered and our final consumption of them as food that many of us cease to give proper moral consideration to those kinds of decisions? How do you re-establish that connection?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think traditionally, I suppose, the vegan movement or the animal rights movement has focused on that kind of approach of things like undercover filming, exposés of especially cruel practices. I think the problem with that, or the risk with that, I think sometimes it works. It has an impact, but sometimes it can turn people off for sure. If people get a hint that there's something upsetting, they won't necessarily look at it. They won't want to confront it. And I think that's why in my own research, with Kate in particular, we've tried to look at it the other way around in a way. So rather than looking at why isn't veganism more prevalent, or that kind of side of it, we're looking at why is non-veganism accepted as normal. So from our perspective, being vegans, non-veganism is abnormal. It doesn't make any sense. So we want to understand why it makes sense to most people. So we're looking at it that way around. So by critiquing things like children's films, we're trying to raise awareness amongst the general population that there's something bad going on here. These aren't just benevolent, benign, inconsequential pieces of entertainment. What they're actually doing is teaching your kids bad lessons about how not to be moral, how not to be compassionate, i.e. how not to think about animals who really need your help and your care.
What would you say to people who would invoke a sort of distant paleo past where we used our appendix and consumed animals in a sort of idealised state of humanity?
Well, there's sort of two answers to that. There is a sort of direct answer that all of those claims are contested, have been contested by vegans who will, you can find these debates online very easily about teeth and digestive systems and so on. But I'm to be honest, I don't care about that question. It doesn't interest me at all, because the situation we're in now is we have decisions that we can make as a society about how we treat other animals. And we know for certain that we can survive perfectly well without exploiting other animals. Therefore we should, and that's the end of it. Whether humans ate meat 10,000 years ago is completely irrelevant to me. The question confronting us now is how should we live in a way that's compassionate. And that means being vegan.
Should veganism be a protected belief system, like a religion?
So I think in terms of, I think there's certainly some value in that, getting legal protection, because for me that would not be so much about the rights of an individual vegan to, say, have vegan food accessible in the work canteen or something. Obviously that would be a good thing, but it's not about that so much as it is about shifting the culture, about helping veganism to be taken seriously as something which is fundamental and not just about, choosing to have beans on toast instead of a burger or something. But I suppose the risk with that is that it makes it possible to marginalise veganism in a different kind of way. So in the same way that any religious belief that's a protected characteristic, no one is going to convert to any specific religion. That's not going to happen. And if you're putting veganism alongside those belief systems, some people might see it as doing a similar thing. Okay, so you've got this subset of vegans, and yes, maybe you can agree that their rights need protecting. They mustn't be forced to, abuse animals in the workplace or whatever it might be, but they're sort of safely parcelled away there with other beliefs that are there as options, but they're not imperatives. So that's a potential pitfall with that approach, I think, because vegans would certainly argue that veganism ought to be universal. And again, just to say the extent to which it currently can't be because of other problems such as wealth inequalities and poverty and food deserts, there's all kinds of practical issues that stand in need of resolution. But that's where the focus should be, resolving those issues so that it becomes the default for everybody. So it's not dependent on any kind of particular quasi-religious point of view.
Do you think government will eventually regulate in the direction of a plant-based diet? And if so, what do you think would precipitate that?
I mean, it's always difficult predicting the future in these kind of ways, but I think one possibility, if this current moment that we're in, where veganism has definitely exploded in the public consciousness, if this is something that we can sustain, then I think there is going to be a need for governments to respond to that, to recognise that they have a veganising population. It's something that is happening. And that means that governments will have a responsibility to care for vegans in a wider sense. So things like the NHS is going to have to gear itself up a lot more to be able to advise people about plant-based nutrition, to be able to look for ways to treat people that don't involve vivisection, where medicines don't contain animal products, where alternatives to animal testings are found, all kinds of ways. Finally, from a vegan point of view, the connection is being made in the environmental movement with animal agriculture. It's been a long time coming because vegans have been arguing this for decades, pointing out the connections. But that is starting to have an impact as well. So again, by the same token, that public demand for action to be taken on climate change and so on, that's going to mean that governments have to respond also in terms of animal agriculture. They're going to have to do stuff. I think veganuary is definitely very helpful. I think because the ambition very clearly within veganuary is that people will stay vegan. So they'll start with a commitment to a month, but then a month is long enough for it to become habit forming, if you like. Not to make it sound like an addiction, but it's something that can become routine within a month so that people think, okay, I might as well just carry on. I feel fine, everything's going well, so I'll stick with it. I think other things like flexitarianism or reducitarianism and so on are more problematic because there's no... even if you take it at face value that it means some kind of reduction in animal use, it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be a reduction at all. It may be the fact that people are compensating, even unconsciously. So they might go, say, plant-based for 1 or 2 days a week, and then on the other days they might end up eating more meat or drinking more milk or whatever. We need more research to find out what the impacts are. But more generally than that, I'm certainly worried that it becomes a way of just appeasing the conscience, maybe especially in terms of environmental impacts. Because I think a lot of us do this anyway. You know, we think, well, I've done my recycling, so I'm not going to worry about driving to XYZ or something. So you can have these kind of trade-offs in your mind. But if you approach veganism from the ethical, its ethical fundamentals about being compassionate to other animals, then that's not possible. You can't have a trade-off where you think, well, I haven't, you know, caused a lamb to be slaughtered today, so I can do it tomorrow. You know, it'll be all right. I saved one today, so I'll kill one next week. You know, it doesn't work. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any moral sense. So I think there are certainly big problems with that side of things. So I definitely would make a distinction with Veganuary, which has vegan ambitions clearly within it. So the extent to which vegan food, plant-based food, becomes more available helps in that process. So if some of that demand is being driven by non-vegans, that's not a bad thing. But it's not a bad thing not because of the utilitarian direction, but because it makes veganism as such more possible for more people. So for instance, now you've got like Greggs doing a vegan sausage roll. That doesn't mean that Greggs is suddenly okay, but it means that veganism might be more thinkable for a wider subset of people. People who happen to pass a Greggs on their way to or from work, say, who might not have easy access to vegan food before, now might think, okay, I can always grab one of them sausage rolls, so maybe it becomes more thinkable. So that kind of thing could certainly have positive effects going forward, but maybe for different reasons.
Simon Ray is a lecturer in sports science at the Open University who specialises in nutrition. In the past, he's worked with both cricket and international hockey teams, as well as individual athletes, about nutrition to optimise sports performance.
If you're going to adopt a 100% vegan diet, there are certain issues that you need to be fully aware of. They are in relation to actually calorie intake on its own. It can be quite hard to get a sufficient number of calories because vegan diets are naturally low in fat, high in fibre, and actually fibre is a little bit of a problem because it makes you feel full, so it means that it becomes harder to eat. Normally the carbohydrate intake is okay, but they are often low-fat diets. And then there's often issues as well with certain micronutrients. Calcium is always the one that's flagged up because obviously calcium is present in dairy products. That's the main source. And then there's also issues with vitamin B12, vitamin D, and other micronutrients such as iodine. In sport, there's also an issue around creatine as well, because creatine is predominantly found in meats, and it's actually used as a supplement by athletes who are working in high-intensity events, so like speed athletes and power athletes.
What is creatine and why is that important?
So creatine is it's a chemical compound which is very similar in structure to proteins, but it's not actually a protein. It is very similar. And creatine is needed in energy production, in the production of adenosine triphosphate. So creatine phosphate is broken down to replace ATP, which is the energy currency of the body. Now creatine, it naturally occurs in the body, but only in very, very small amounts. But there's quite a lot of creatine in meat, poultry and fish, and it's virtually absent in in fruit and vegetables. And so if you've got an omnivore diet, you will get more creatine, and that then it helps the high intensity muscle contractions. So for sprinting or powerlifting or bodybuilding, where you need energy quickly, creatine is a really key component. Creatine is used as a supplement by omnivore athletes anyway. It has been for about 20-25 years. And so you can get vegan sources of creatine as a supplement.
What would you say are the main differences between plant and meat-based sources of protein?
There's a big difference between animal-based protein and plant-based protein in terms of what we call the amino acid profile. I need to just run through a little bit of science here, but in the body we've got 50,000 different structures which are made of proteins, and amino acids are the smallest unit of a protein. And there's 20 amino acids, And from those 20 amino acids, it's a bit like the alphabet where you've got 26 letters and they make up all those millions of words. You've got 20 amino acids which make up all these thousands of different structures of the body, different protein profiles. Now, of those 20 amino acids, we've got 9 which are called essential and 11 non-essential. And essential means it has to be gained from the diet. And if you can get all 9 essential amino acids, the liver will synthesize the other 11 and you'll get your full 20. Now, meat, poultry, fish, dairy products, if you eat those, you will get all 9 essential amino acids and then you'll be able to produce the other 11, which is the ideal scenario. Now, most plant-based sources of protein will be missing 1 or more of the 9 essential amino acids. So, for example, pulses or beans, they've got 7 out of the 9. Wheat has got 7 out of the 9. So all the sources are slightly deficient, apart from the soybean. The soybean has got all 9 essential amino acids, but only just enough of each one. So athletes in particular, and actually the general public, but athletes in particular need to eat more than one source of protein at a meal. So, for example, like the classic meal, beans on toast. So you'd get you get 7 from the wheat, 7 from the beans, and luckily they're the ones that are deficient in the wheat are present in the beans. So it's called complementary protein or protein partnering. For an athlete, you have to get all of the amino acids at every meal, the 3 meals you have in the day. For a non-athlete, as long as you're getting them across the day, then that's fine. It's only half the story, because when you eat a protein food, it gets digested, it gets broken down in the small intestine, stored in the liver, and plant sources of amino acids they're more vulnerable to the digestive process. So the animal sources of protein, the animal amino acids, they travel through the digestive system without being damaged. So if you had equal amounts of animal protein and plant protein, more of the animal protein would get to where it's needed in the muscles and the structures of the body. So when we talk about muscle protein synthesis, which is the production of muscle from the amino acids. So muscle protein synthesis is more effective from animal sources than plant sources. Again, we're not saying it can't be done, it's just not as efficient. There is an additional thing for athletes in that exercise, in particular strength training, so like bodybuilding or weightlifting, is very, what we call catabolic. It breaks down proteins, and in particular it breaks down what we call the branched chain amino acids. If you ever have a look at like protein supplements, it always says high in branched chain amino acids. That's because they get broken down, they get catabolized by high intensity exercise. And they are leucine, isoleucine and valine, but in particular leucine is a problem because plant sources of leucine, it's much harder to get leucine from plant sources than it is from animal sources. So, that's just an additional problem.
So is it fair to say a vegan diet might favour an endurance athlete over an athlete requiring a quick explosion of energy?
That's a fair summary. Yeah. So for a what we call an anaerobic athlete, one like a power or speed athlete, because they're muscle based and muscle recovery based, it becomes more difficult that end. For the endurance athlete, actually, it can be quite effective because vegan diets tend to be high in carbohydrate. Things like rice, potatoes, even pasta, they tend to be, staples of the vegan diet. So you're getting lots of carbohydrate, which is great for endurance running. You've got to be a little bit careful about fat because, as I said, vegan diets are low in fat. And actually, there's a little bit of a misconception that endurance athletes just run off carbohydrates, because in actual fact, they always burn a mixture of fats and carbohydrates. And particularly for like long, slow events, it's predominantly fat-based actually. Some of the carbohydrates will only be used when the intensity it rises. So And actually, so endurance athletes do need a lot of fat, and vegan diets, as I say, they tend to be low in fats. However, there is a solution for this, because foods like avocados, nuts, seeds, olives, olive oils, they are high in fats, so that you can get the fats that you need there. So I think it's a fair summary. So you get high carbs, you can get the fats if need be. You do need the protein to replace the muscle that's broken down, but it's a lot less in an endurance athlete than it would be in a power or speed athlete. A plant-based diet will be highly beneficial in certain things, in that it is high fibre. Okay, sometimes it's too high in fibre, but it is high fibre, so that will prevent bowel cancer, colon cancer. It'll reduce the risk of heart disease. If a vegan diet is taken from natural sources, but by that I mean rather than choosing like processed foods, I know that you can get like vegan cheeses and things which tend to be quite highly processed. But if you're just eating fruit and veg, you do get massive amounts of antioxidants. Now, antioxidants protect against oxidative damage in the body. It's one of these contradictions of life, that in order to survive, we need oxygen. But oxygen does massive damage in the body. It's a bit like, the old, if you leave a bicycle out for a long time, it'll rust. Oxygen will rust. It'll tear that bicycle apart. And the same thing happens in our bodies. So as we breathe in, the oxygen produces things called free radicals, which damage arteries, which damage nerves. And so we need to take antioxidants, so they're like the tablets that we take to basically neutralize the free radicals. Okay, they stop them doing their damage. And vitamins A, C, E, zinc and selenium are the antioxidant nutrients. If we get a lot of those, which a vegan diet will give you loads of those micronutrients, then that prevents oxidative stress in the body, so they act as antioxidants. So that is a massive benefit of vegan diets. They will be healthier because they will protect against heart disease and damage from oxygen.
We hear a lot about plant-based diets being quite high in fibre. What's the role of fibre in the body, and why is too much of it a problem?
So fibre does two things. It slows down the release of foods from the stomach. Okay, and that's a good thing, because we want a nice steady flow of glucose into the bloodstream. So yeah, fiber's bulky. It gets in the way of everything. So it slows down the release of foods from the stomach, which, as I say, nutritionally speaking, is a good thing. But then it speeds up the transit of the waste products through the large intestine. So it makes your feces bulkier, and it makes you more regular. So you go more often, but also it picks up any like nasty stuff that's hanging around in the large intestine and gets rid of it. And it's those things that cause, that can be a risk for colon cancer and diseases like diverticulitis, where the parts of the large intestine become inflamed. So you're absolutely right. So fibre slows down in the stomach but speeds up in the intestines, speeds up transit in the intestines. Too much fibre is not necessarily a good thing. Vegan athletes, they talk about, not eating if they have a baked potato, they take the skin off. If they have an apple, they peel it to get rid of the fibre. So, because what they need is the calories. They need the calories. And like fibre slows everything down. It's great for health, but actually it can be a detriment to performance.
Do you think movements like Veganuary are helpful in making us think about what we consume?
Well, I do think that these movements are helpful, that promote different types of diets, because they do, in a way they educate us, they get us to think about, every meal that we prepare. There's problems with high meat diets, problems in terms of, bowel cancer, and, we don't really need that much meat. And I'm quite in favour of flexitarian approaches, so where you have meat-free days. So because if you eat a lot of meat, you probably don't get, enough fruit and veg, and therefore you don't get the micronutrients that fruit and veg offer, and the health benefits of those as well. So I think being flexible in your approach and, not eating meat every day, but, trying fish and actually trying out vegetarian, even vegan meals, I believe that is the way forward. I mean, we're all aware of the damage that cows do, with the methane in the environment. And that's a significant problem. Yeah. And, if we had fewer animals, then we'd have more land for crops to be grown. But I think in my field, in sports nutrition, I think a flexitarian approach, and people do feel different. Like every food has a biochemical impact on the body. If you have, red meats are heavy and they take a lot of energy for the body to digest, and that can make you feel tired. You generally do feel if you've had something plant-based, you don't get the fatigue that you maybe do with meats. Digestion of meats raises your temperature. Some people start sweating if they eat a steak. That's just because it's taking a lot of energy to digest the steak. Some people do feel a lot better if they've eaten fish or if they have eaten, plant-based meals.
Share your thoughts on this episode's topic by using the hashtag OUInformed. This episode was brought to you by the OU social media engagement team and produced and presented by Greg Harwood. We'll see you next time.